Greetings all, this is Bill Burke, and I'm very excited to bring you this latest episode of Blue Sky. But before I do that, I wanted to share this short announcement from one of our newest partners, the great podcast from Pushkin Industries, A Slight Change of Plans.
Hey there, I'm Dr. Maya Shankar, and I'm a scientist who studies human behavior. Many of us have experienced a moment in our lives that changes everything, that instantly divides our life into a before and an after. On my podcast, A Slight Change of Plans, I talk to people about navigating these moments. Their stories are full of candor and hard-won wisdom. And you'll hear from scientists who teach us how we can be more resilient in the face of change. Listen on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
From the studios of the Optimism Institute, welcome to the Blue Sky Podcast. I'm your host, Bill Burke, and in every Blue Sky episode, we'll be speaking to leaders, researchers, and thinkers whose stories and insights will remind us that there is always blue sky above. Sometimes you just have to get your head above the clouds to see it. In this Blue Sky episode, we'll be discussing one of the most difficult challenges in our society and one of the greatest threats to our functioning democracy, political polarization. Now, while I do push back on the idea that, as many like to say, our country has never been more divided, we did fight a years-long civil war after all, and the summer of 1968 also comes to mind, just to cite two examples. I do agree that this issue is clearly getting worse. And as today's Blue Sky guest points out, we're allowing our political differences to blow up into personal animosities in a way that's not good for anyone. Dan Stone has been a behavioral economist at Bowdoin College since 2012, and prior to that taught for 4 years at Oregon State University. His research interests are wide, including belief biases, political media, polarization, sports, and socially responsible capitalism. Most relevant to our conversation today, he is the author of Undue, a behavioral economic analysis of hostile polarization in U.S. politics and beyond. More generally, his goals in his work are to improve belief formation, raise awareness of social impacts, and fight inefficiency. Dan's originally from Charlottesville, Virginia, and today he lives in Bowdoin's beautiful hometown of Brunswick, Maine, with his wife and 2 sons. None of us, including Dan, has all the answers here, but you'll hear his take on some of the causes of our challenges, as well as some ideas, both structural and personal, that may get us on a better path. I hope you enjoyed this Blue Sky conversation with Dan Stone as much as I did. Dan Stone, welcome to the Blue Sky Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
It's a real pleasure. I read your book, Undue. I enjoyed it a great deal. There are sort of the big 3 topics that seem to keep people from being optimistic these days that I hear over and over again are climate change, and then sort of a blanket, the media, social media, that sort of thing, and then polarization and political division. So you are certainly on point 3, maybe even a little bit of point 2. But I'd like to start with your subtitle is a behavioral economic analysis of hostile polarization in the U.S. politics and beyond. So you are a behavioral economist. A lot of folks listening might not know what that is. Could you explain what that is, and then also how that discipline led you to explore the topic that you do in Undue Hate?
Yeah, sure. So economists have traditionally assumed that people are extremely rational decision makers. So mostly for the sake of simplifying our models and our theory, we've assumed that people, they can have whatever preferences they want, but given those preferences, given their budget constraints, their other constraints, that people kind of make best decision that they can, given their preferences, and that they also do a really good job of forming accurate beliefs given the information that's available, and even that they're pretty smart about seeking out the information which is most useful for them given their preferences and their other constraints. So typically economists assume people are just sort of almost robotic,
Right.
Perfect decision makers. And of course, in reality, we're not. But figuring out the ways in which we deviate from this classical ultra rational model is a lot harder to do than you might think. So behavioral economics is in large part the study of the ways that people sort of systematically screw up or deviate from this classical model of rationality, and not just make mistakes, but also ways. It's also traditionally typically been assumed that people are essentially primarily self-interested,
Mm-hmm.
and behavioral economists recognize that people are not completely self-interested. We truly do care about other people. We care about our reputations. We care about fairness, things like that. So incorporating psychological, sociological, almost philosophical factors into trying to come up with a better model of how people really behave.
So how does this get you to political polarization?
Yeah. So one of the big issues in behavioral economics is that, in economics in general, people face uncertainty, right?
Mm-hmm.
Certainty is the exception rather than the rule. So we face uncertainty, which means we don't know what's going to happen. We form these beliefs under uncertainty. And the ideal mathematical way to form these beliefs is to use this thing called Bayes' rule, to be a Bayesian belief updater. And that's what economists have traditionally assumed people are, even though no one's, of course, using the Bayesian mathematical formula in their heads, but people assume roughly approximately people are Bayesian. And so one of the big topics in behavioral economics is studying ways that people systematically are off in their beliefs. We can be overconfident about some things, underconfident in others. We can overreact to some information, underreact to others. So that's belief formation and biases of beliefs is, of course, going to be very relevant to politics and polarization especially, because polarization, everything in politics is driven by beliefs under uncertainty. And my take on polarization is that much of it is driven by the same types of biases that behavioral economists study in other contexts, biases that affect economic decisions. Those also influence our beliefs on political issues and also our beliefs about other people in politics.
Yeah. Okay. So one of the concepts you write about quite a bit in your book is affective polarization, affective with an A. Can you explain what that is and maybe give us some examples?
Yeah. So that's kind of the technical term for like emotional polarization, rather than as opposed to ideological or opinion polarization, where people just disagree. Some think climate change is happening and some think it's not or something. Affective polarization is when our feelings toward those we disagree with grow apart, when we grow to increasingly dislike those we disagree with. So political scientists, especially for decades, were sort of debating, are Americans actually becoming more polarized, and had been focused on ideological polarization. The evidence for that had been pretty thin. And then about 10 years ago, people discovered, oh, wait, the evidence that we're becoming affectively polarized is super strong and clear. That Democrats and Republicans almost perfectly symmetrically have increasingly grown to dislike the other party more over the last 4 decades or so now. So going back to 1980, there's like this pretty steady trend of feelings toward the other party getting colder and colder, dislike of the other party growing more and more.
And dislike of individuals in the other party too, right? Like personalizing it possibly a little bit more.
Yeah. I mean, the individuals affect our feelings toward the group, and our feelings toward the group affect the individuals. But there's a lot of data showing that when people are asked how they feel about the other party as a whole, those feelings have become steadily colder. And why do feelings matter? Well, the more you dislike someone, the more you distrust them, the less willing you are to work with them, to cooperate with them, and any kind of thing, the more you're willing to bend the rules to beat them. And there's all kinds of nasty implications.
So once you have that starting point, then you get into some of the other topics in your book, like false polarization. And I think you wrote, we politicize issues that are not inherently political. And we just lived through that with masks and vaccines. So is that sort of a outgrowth of this really strong affective polarization?
Yeah, to me, I think of false polarization. It's not my favorite term, but it's a pretty standard term for I would define it as overestimation of ideological polarization. So Democrats and Republicans think that their opinions on policy issues are more polarized or are more different than they really are. We actually have more in common with the other party on basic policy issues than we think. We agree more on immigration and gun control and these divisive issues. So because we overestimate this disagreement and we dislike people that we disagree with, that contributes to our dislike of the other side. We think the other side's a bunch of extremists who have these very different opinions. So false polarization, to me, it's both a cause and an effect of affective polarization. And what I call affective polarization bias, which is too much affective, an irrational degree of affective polarization.
Right. And then you also get into, this might have been my favorite section, and we could have a little game with our audience here, false partisan stereotypes. So you gave more than two, but my two favorite statistics in here, and this is where we could play a game, sort of, let's say that a stereotype is Republicans think that Democrats are sort of godless atheists, right? And Democrats think that Republicans are a bunch of rich fat cats. So when you ask Republicans, what percentage of Democrats do you think are atheists? I can ask our audience to think about what their number would be. Republicans estimate that 36% of Democrats are atheists. Democrats actually think the number is 25%, but the actual number is 9%. So that shows in a sort of an inflation of the stereotype. Then let's go to the wealth side of things. You know, what percentage of the GOP earns more than $250,000 a year? Pause. You can think about your answer. Democrats guess 44% of Republicans earn more than $250,000 a year. Republicans themselves think it's 33%. The actual number is 2.2%. So when you, it seems to me, you glob on this polarization, this dislike, and then it allows stereotypes to just run wild and get reinforced by whatever you're pulling off of social media, or however it happens, but it's not healthy. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. And just to quickly note that those numbers are from at least 5 years ago. So, especially the income numbers would be bumped up a little now because of inflation.
Could be worse.
But maybe the distortion's even worse. So, my big point in the book is, we normally think of feelings of dislike, feelings I like a person, I dislike a person, just a feeling. So it's hard to say that it's like right or wrong or irrational or rational. And what I talk about is that there's all this evidence that we have these false beliefs about who the other side is, about their character traits, their demographics, their opinions. And there's a lot of evidence that these false beliefs contribute to our feelings. And if our feelings are based on false information, then our feelings can essentially be just wrong, irrational. We're just
right.
And so this is a piece of evidence that we're just disliking the other side more than we should. If we understood them properly, we wouldn't dislike them this much. And again, so the dislike can contribute to this causality goes both ways, but the direction that I focus on is the distorted stereotype contributes. We think the other side is associated with these extreme stereotypes more than they really are. And we don't like the stereotype, and that makes us dislike we underestimate how heterogeneous, how varied they are, how much they're like ourselves. And that's going to naturally make us feel more hostile toward them than we actually should, even based on our own definition of what hostility should be based on.
It's interesting to hear how working in the field of behavioral economics led to Dan's study of political division. And regarding the roots of this problem, as we've discussed many times on Blue Sky, we all have a tendency to look back too fondly on the past and assume that so many of today's problems are new when they're not. Case in point here is the research suggesting that our country's challenges with polarization go back to the early 80s, starting well before social media. And this idea of affective polarization is a helpful one to understand, that increasingly we take political differences, which we've always had, and extend them to become biases against the actual people with whom we disagree, not just their ideas. This, it seems to me, really gets at the crux of our challenges today, and something we should all think about in our own lives. Now, back to our conversation and a discussion of the increase in people linking their personal identity to their political party or movement. You identify that party identities have been strengthened, or at least they're a bigger part of who we think we are, how we define ourselves. And it seems to me that that's a huge generational shift. At least I think about when I was a kid and, my parents and their friends, when I wasn't voting, I didn't know who this guy voted for, that woman voted. Maybe they had a sticker on their car, maybe. But I feel like now people are so identified. Some have even said it's sort of the new religion. Sort of if you had 3 adjectives to use to describe yourself, one might be your political persuasion. It just didn't used to be that way. Is that a fair way to describe it?
Yeah, and that's something that other people have written more about than me. So just to be clear, that's not a novel theory in my book. If anything, I'm almost trying to make some contributions to talk about some factors that contribute to the polarization beyond this idea. But it's an important thing. Yeah, we take politics more personally. And so when our party's attacked, we feel like we're personally attacked. And of course, we don't have the most accurate views of ourselves, right? We think of ourselves, we can be blind to our own flaws in many ways, and we can overestimate our own strengths. And just as we do that about ourselves, we're going to do it for our parties as we come to identify more with the parties.
Yeah, I think you use the term over precision. We think we're right all the time. We think we're more right than we are. We don't have the intellectual humility that we probably should. And that's I'm sure we've always had some of that, but you would argue that's a growing trend?
Over precision. So that's a term I love, which is not, it's becoming more and more common, and it's maybe never going to be super popular with the general public, but it refers to holding overly precise beliefs, essentially thinking you know more than you really do, being overconfident in the certainty of your beliefs. And it's common sense that this happens. People are very prone to being overconfident, that we think we tend to be sure about things that we should not be so sure about.
Right.
Where we jump to conclusions, we forget about all the things, the unknown unknowns.
Right.
And I don't know that over precision is becoming more common in general, but it's certainly relevant to our political beliefs. And as we've come across more and more information indicating that our preferred party is the morally and intellectually superior party, and the opposition party is worse, that over precision is going to kick in and make us overconfident in the skewed information. Right. And our information has become more one-sided due to social media, cable news, partisan segregation, the fact that our neighbors are more politically like-minded than ever, our counties are more like-minded, our coworkers are more like-minded, we're less, our spouses, our families are more politically homogenous. So the more our information gives us the chance to be certain in our beliefs, doesn't force us to second-guess ourselves, the more the over-precision is going to sort of exacerbate that and just lead us to be overly certain in this very, we all just are seeing a very small slice of reality, right?
Right.
Small piece of the elephant. And it's all too human to assume we know it all when we just know a little bit.
So I often take shots at social media on this podcast. You brought it up this time, not me. But so I'd like to talk a little bit about that, because when you see these trends and these changes, of course, you want to ask yourself, well, why? Why now? Why? What is driving this? And I'm sure there are many factors, but it does seem to me that this ability or this ease of, you wake up with a certain political persuasion and then you spend your day being fed more information that supports that and demonizes the other side, then you're going to go to bed even more on that side than you were when you woke up. And we didn't have that before. What role do you think that sort of user-generated content, social media has played in this in the last 10, 15 years?
Yeah, I do think it plays an important role, but it's definitely not the only factor. And most researchers think it's actually a surprisingly small factor. I'm not sure. We're still working on figuring that out. I lean toward worrying more about social media than a lot of people in the space, but the trends certainly the affective polarization trend started before social media existed. It goes
Right.
back to the 80s.
Okay.
Think about Bill Clinton and the impeachment in the 90s and the Republican
Sure.
Revolution in 94.
Yep.
And cable news
Yep.
is a factor as well. And that's both a cause and an effect.
Right.
So we only
Right.
had the demand for partisan cable news. It's not explicitly partisan, but it's obviously ideologically segmented. And the other thing is, social media exists all over the world, but affective polarization is particularly bad in the US. But there are trends of polarization increasing around the world, which supports the idea that social media is exacerbating things. So social media is part of the problem. It's not the only problem. I mean, I worry about it being a problem with mental health stuff, and
Sure.
especially for teens and things like that. And I think that's a different issue. It's part of the problem, but it's not the only cause for sure.
So, to the extent that this is a product of the Optimism Institute, and this can be a pretty tough subject and discouraging one, I'd love to talk about maybe some rays of hope or ways that we might get out of this. One question I had for you is, if I understand it, people identify as Democrat or Republican, registered in their parties. The percentages are maybe like 30% for both, kind of, and maybe 40 to 50% of Americans are self-described as independent or unaffiliated. And I think that number might even be growing, the independent number. And I just wonder if maybe that's a sign of there's a lot of people sort of more in the middle who are kind of getting tired of all this, or is that just me looking for the pony in the horse manure?
Yeah. I'm honestly not sure about those numbers. I haven't heard about there being major trends there. Even if you're right that there is plenty of data showing that large majority, or at least a majority of people are relatively moderate and relatively sick of really just truly want there to be more unity and less vitriol and so on. But there is this fundamental problem where the people who are more moderate tend to be quieter, tend to be less sure of themselves, tend to be less active in politics. And so the political activists tend to be more extreme. The politicians themselves are more beholden to the activists, or more extreme, or there's evidence that politicians are actually more likely to have what are called the dark triad traits, traits that are essentially, undesirable traits in humans.
Yes.
Selfishness.
Well, yeah, and you said they don't get involved. Moderates don't get involved in politics. I think part of it is because it's really hard to win with closed primaries, and like you said, people of like interests tend to live together. So if you vote in a primary and you run and you're sort of more moderate or independent, you're not going to win if it's a closed primary, and the more extremes of whatever party it is that controls that district, you don't have much of a chance.
Yeah, but there are a lot of voices out there pushing for for smart reforms to depolarize, and for people to bridge these divides and to think. There's a lot of talk. Are we going to make progress anytime soon? I don't know. I mean, I'm optimistic in the long term, in that I do think the arc of history will bend in the right direction, and most people are ultimately going to be reasonable about these things, and the voices who are pushing for what's best for the country will ultimately be listened to. In the short run, I certainly don't have any strong predictions, and who knows what's going to happen. I will say when you do hear people sometimes saying something like Trump is going to win for sure, and that's certainly not true. So there's still a lot of time before the election in the fall, and prediction markets are what I look to for the best sort of information about the likelihood of prediction markets, where people actually bet on the outcomes of elections. I think are more useful to look at than polls. And they've been saying that Trump and Biden both had about a 40% chance of winning the election. Right. Trump is up a little bit in the prediction market that I've looked at recently, but he's still under 50%. So in the sense that there's a lot of uncertainty, maybe that's an optimistic point. Yeah. So time will tell, but I'm optimistic about human nature. I think most people are decent, appreciate truth, want to get along, are capable of getting along, and fights can spiral for periods of time, but ultimately we'll get through it one way or the other.
I agree with what Dan just said about most people being decent, and it's always helpful to stop and remind ourselves of that. It's also interesting to hear what Dan has to say about how increasingly it seems we tend to both live in and work at places where our colleagues share our political views. I've little doubt that this also applies to college campuses, and this could be a cause for the challenges we've been seeing there. And let's hear it again for intellectual humility, understanding that there is so much we don't know, and frankly, that we're probably wrong about, can go a long way towards opening us up to be more tolerant of people with whom we disagree. Going back to another cause, because this occurred to me earlier today, and I should have asked you earlier, but I'll ask you now. One of the things I wondered about is we as a country, let's just talk about the United States, we've often had causes or frankly sort of enemies that united us. So, when I was growing up, it was the Cold War, and, we would boycott the Moscow Olympics, and most Americans supported that because damn those communists. And there were things that pulled us together. Obviously, World War II, going after the Axis, we've just had a lot of those in our history. After 9/11, the country came together in sympathy, but then also, there were celebrations when bin Laden was caught. I wonder now if it's hard to even point to who that is when, traditionally, Republicans would do anything to fund, causes against Russia. And now it's a little more amorphous, and maybe it's the Chinese, but not really. I don't feel like we have that unifying enemy. Not that that's necessarily a great thing to have that, but I wonder in the absence of that gives us more room and appetite to go after each other.
Yeah, no, I think that is part of the story for why we've turned on each other more over the last few decades, especially since the Cold War ended. Lack of a clear external threat has caused us to view others within as the threat. And the question is, suppose there was a clear external threat to arise at this point, would we be able to unify? Hopefully, it's
an interesting question.
Definitely, it's a bit of a concern, to say the least.
So I'm talking to you. You're a professor at a small liberal arts college, Bowdoin College in Maine. So you spend a lot of your time working with younger people. And I'd love to talk with you about this subject of polarization and that group, sort of the 18 to 22-year-old. On the one hand, on a lot of measures, it's arguably the most tolerant generation ever when it comes to social issues and a lot of those things. But then on the other hand, you might feel like you hear that there's a lot of concern about speaking openly about certain subjects and cancel culture and all these things you hear about. It's blown up with the Gaza-Israel situation and college presidents hemming and hawing about free speech and what's good and what isn't. What are your thoughts on that generation that you teach and what they might be bringing into the world as they become now their voters and active in politics?
Yeah, that's definitely a good question. I think that they are generally much more open to dialogue and dissent than you might think from just seeing the headlines and hearing some horror stories. I knock wood, I haven't had a single issue in my career of a student claiming to be offended or, of having some serious issue with something I've said or even something someone else has said in class. I find that if you're thoughtful about it, they appreciate discussion of tough subjects and hearing about a variety of viewpoints. But I think they also are quiet, and they're concerned about the repercussions to saying something that could be perceived as offending or as offending. Or so I think the risk of cancellation, so to speak, is lower than people think, but there is some real risk, which has led people to self-censor and to be overly careful with what they say. So there is a real problem of people not feeling free to express themselves, and as always, there are going to be some people with more extreme opinions who are more sure of themselves than others, and they're going to be the ones who are the loudest and we hear the most of. And it's, you don't hear about the quiet majority. So that applies to college campuses as well. So that's happening, with Israel, Gaza, I think to some extent. On our campus, we haven't had outright conflict over this, but the voices, it's been interesting for sure. There's an active Students for Justice in Palestine group that's been pretty outspoken. And I think there are students who don't agree with it completely, and even faculty and staff who have not felt comfortable sharing their opinions. And there's a combination of factors going on there. Part of it is the asymmetry of the conflict and the fact that it is the Palestinians that are suffering from the war now, of course, but the conflict itself is extremely complicated, and there's many perspectives that one could hold, and to be very certain about any aspect of this conflict would suggest over precision and overconfidence to me. So I think there's been some self-censorship. And on our campus, we've had a bigger issue with self-censorship rather than overconfident polarization leading to outright clashing. But of course, that's happened on some other campuses.
It's interesting because I hadn't thought of it this way, but it feels like on the college campuses, there's too much self-censorship. And with people older, there might not be enough, right?
It's useful.
We start by talking about how people are slinging and saying terrible things about the other side, and then talking about younger people. When you think back to college protests during Vietnam and other times, it was probably the opposite. There was much wilder and louder on college campuses, and I don't know. It's a kind of an interesting switch.
Yeah. I mean, it's been an active time, so there's definitely some loud voices, and there've been some clashes on other campuses, and that's just always going to happen to some extent. Is that a function of our generation, social media? I think social media has been especially perhaps misleading for younger people, because they do use things like TikTok, where the veracity of the information is especially questionable, and so I think there are legitimate questions about whether people are particularly misinformed on this issue, or younger people are misinformed. Yeah. In general, I don't think it's ruined a generation or anything close to that. I think, most people are craving reasonable dialogue, but a lot of the reasonable people are thinking it's easier to stay quiet. And
right.
Frankly, I include myself in that group. I mean, it can be pretty tricky.
It's helpful to hear from a college professor, especially one writing and teaching about this particular subject, acknowledging that while his own school does pretty well in the areas of speech and campus conflict, things can get, as he says, tricky, and that students and even some professors are sometimes guarded about what they do and do not say. For our final segment, Dan talks some more about potential solutions, beginning with at least a national acknowledgement that polarization is a problem, possibly leading to what he's described, and I love this, as an Anti-Polarization Manhattan Project. In your book, getting back to some more hopefulness, you talk about an Anti-Polarization Manhattan Project, which is a great way to describe it. I think a lot of us would agree it'd be high time to try something like that. And you talk about things we could work towards doing. I mean, cut your hate in half was one of the things I like that you said. What are some of those things that you feel like we can do, sort of both in terms of our own personal behavior, and then we can also talk about some structural changes like ranked choice voting and open primaries and that sort of thing. But in terms of a Manhattan Project, how would you see that working, and how does that get championed and started?
Yeah.
Paint a picture for us.
I've actually been working a bit with a guy named Zach Elwood, who is a former professional poker player who in the last few years has been mostly working on and thinking about political polarization. And he's got a book on polarization too. It's quite good. I recommend it. We wrote a piece together pushing for an Anti-Polarization Manhattan Project, basically saying polarization is, well, we think it's the country's biggest problem because it's what prevents us from solving other problems.
Right.
And we've had trouble getting it out, getting anyone to bite on it. But our point is, why we have this huge problem and yet politicians aren't doing anything to address it. And what could they do? Well, one thing they could do would be to say, we don't know what to do, but so let's put some resources into figuring out what to do. Let's put together a task force with some resources, some funding, where people think about the best ideas for solutions and duke it out and make some proposals for real solutions. So as we get closer to the election, this seems increasingly unrealistic, but we're still, why isn't Biden saying polarizations are one of our country's biggest problems? This is what I'm going to do about it. So what, right. and then there's a question of what could we possibly do? One specific idea that I think is, it's not going to solve everything, but I find appealing is Supreme Court term limits. And I don't know if anyone's pushing for this hard, but with rotating appointments between the parties. So given that we have these two dominant parties, given that so much of the presidential campaign now is driven by the desire to have the power to fill Supreme Court openings in particular and appoint judges in general. And people are willing to hold their nose and vote for someone they don't like in order for their party to control Supreme Court appointments. I think it would be pretty useful if we just said, you know what, let's just, first of all, we can't let these guys stay in office. These people stay in office forever. You get an 18-year term or some fixed term, and Democrats appoint one, Republicans appoint the next one, Democrats appoint the one after that. There could be problems with this proposal, I'm sure, but it would just take a bit of the wind out of the sails for, some of a downside to, the importance of the presidential elections, which makes some people willing to support people with character issues. So rotating Supreme Court appointments. There are other structural ideas like ways to, some people think having two-party competition is the fundamental issue. So there's some ideas for getting more parties actual representation, like allowing congressional districts to elect more than one member, some multi-member congressional districts with ranked choice voting. There's some research showing this would lead 3, 4, 5 parties to get representation. And that would also reduce the intensity of the hostility between Democrats and Republicans. If there's other parties involved in the fight, it wouldn't be so much of a zero-sum battle between those two. What else? I mean, on a day-to-day basis, I think we should all think about being ambassadors for our teams, and we don't walk around. I mean, if you've got a label on your car or something, you've got a Biden sticker. be a courteous driver and show people that Biden voters are nice people. If you got a Trump sticker, do that too. If you want to show that Trump voters are good guys and are misunderstood, don't cut people. And that's almost symbolic for it. It used to be that during the COVID time, wearing a mask could often be a strong symbol of what your politics were, and not wearing a mask was. And so I would suggest to people, if you're going to be a mask wearer, go out of your way to be friendly, to show that you're not a snobby mask wearer who refuses to talk to someone who's unmasked, and again, vice versa.
I think too, when you have those conversations, you said earlier that people agree on more with quote unquote the other side than they realize. And I interviewed a guy named Kevin Kelly, and he said, when you have conversations with people, start with the list of things you agree on. And by the time you're done with that list, you realize that the things you don't agree on are really more the exceptions than all the other. You want your kids to be healthy, you want the country to thrive, these sorts of things. And then you get down to these 2 or 3 things that consume so much oxygen.
The other point that I think it's so basic and obvious, and yet we forget it all the time, is it's okay to disagree too. And so even if we disagree on a bunch of things, that doesn't mean we have to dislike each other. Because if we had gone through the life experiences that the other person has gone through, our opinions would be quite different as well. And, there can be a lot of reasons for holding different opinions that we just fail to appreciate, and things are more complicated than we think. So it's very non-intuitive, it's very natural to just get riled up and for tempers to flare as soon as someone expresses a bit of disagreement. But if we can just learn to realize, it's okay to have different opinions, we can still be friends, or we can at least still, be friendly acquaintances or get along. That we need to be able to do that. So I know it's trite, and yet it's this funny thing. I say it, it's like, of course we should be able to disagree, but we haven't figured it out yet. And we just need to keep reminding ourselves, because frankly, another thing I talk about in the book is how a lot of political anger and hostility can be analogous to hostility that comes up in a lot of relationships between friends and colleagues and family, brothers and sisters and husbands and wives. Disagreement can spiral into anger, hostility, dislike, even hate, even between brothers and neighbors and things. And even when people share a lot of social identities, they're on the same team, they're both whatever, white Christian Nebraskans, they can grow to hate each other's guts. And usually there's a fundamental misunderstanding at the root of that, or many misunderstandings that spiral. And so the hate is undue hate. It's built on irrational perception. And that's what's going on in politics most of the time as well.
So Dan, is this a subject you're going to keep pushing on and researching, until it gets better, or you move on to other things, or has this become your real passion?
I've been working on it a while. I started this website called Media Trades that allowed people on opposite sides of the political spectrum to trade media content. Done some other stuff like that. And to be honest, have been a little bit disappointed with, I don't know, things are not getting better in the way that I'd like them to. And yet I'm still drawn to it. I'm still thinking about it and working on it. So in some ways, it's been a struggle for me to maintain my motivation, to be honest, but I'm definitely still working on it and thinking about it. So, and I'm inspired by others who are still working on this. So there's this new organization called Starts With Us that I'm going to be involved with that's working on educating people about what they call the perception gap or false polarization. They're going to try to get involved in schools and teaching kids that the parties aren't as different as we think. I've been doing some work on ESG investing and social responsible capitalism, and I've got some data showing that people agree across the aisle there more than we think. That's a more bipartisan thing. So I'm definitely still working on it, but it's a tough nut to crack. I think what we just need to remember that, in the short term, we can all do a small our part to depolarize a little bit just about every day, because we still do come across people from the other, even in professionals. You go to certain parts of town or certain businesses and this and that, and just do what you can to depolarize and to inspire goodwill wherever you can.
Well, I can see why this could be discouraging work, but I know I speak for myself and probably for a lot of our listeners, and we hope you hang in there, because I think there are more people with your concerns than there are who just don't have a concern about this. And maybe it's the silent majority. I think it might be. And they're getting louder, I think. And we'll see where the dust settles after this 24 presidential election. But I do think there's a huge appetite to try to lower the temperature on this. And I encourage people to read your book, Undue Hate, and think about this and behave in different ways, because it's the only way this is going to change. And the current state is not healthy for this country. So I applaud you for your work, and I hope you'll hang in there.
Well, thanks. Ditto. Thanks for your work as well and for spreading this message. Yeah, I'll do my best.
Hang in there.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dan. Dan laid out a series of interesting potential solutions to our political division, from term limits for Supreme Court justices to changing congressional representation. And who knows, perhaps Dan Stone could be the Robert Oppenheimer of this new Manhattan Project. But at a minimum, acknowledging this issue as a national problem would be a great first step. And we should all think about what we can do personally and on a day-to-day basis to address this issue. And as the title of Dan's book suggests, so many of what we feel towards people with whom we disagree is undue hate. And it's not doing any of us any good. I hope you enjoy this Blue Sky episode with Daniel Stone. Before you go, it'd be great if you left us a rating or review. We'd love to hear more about how you think we're doing. And if you like this sort of content, follow the Optimism Institute on social media. Sign up for the Blue Sky Weekend newsletter on our website. And of course, subscribe to this show wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time, I'm the founder of the Optimism Institute and host of Blue Sky, Bill Burke. And I thank you for listening.